Hey guys, tonight, let's go back in time to learn about a true story. Imagine a morning in England more than 400 years ago. There were no newspapers, no morning news, and no hot cup of coffee to start the day. Instead, there was a solemn silence, where every small sound carried great meaning. We'll be learning about one of history's greatest figures, Queen Elizabeth I, and her terrifying morning rituals. This story isn't glamorous at all, but it's an important part of what made a great dynasty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't be shy about sharing where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating to know that this story is reaching friends all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Whitehall lay in a hush, tinged with a subtle apprehension as dawn's first light began to stir the sky. When those earliest rays, delicate as butterfly wings, hesitated just beyond the window panes, the entire palace seemed to linger in the final moments of its long, dream-filled slumber. The soft footfalls of the lady attendants, light as down, echoed across the straw-covered floors, each step tentative as though fearful of rousing the latent nightmares coiled within the ancient stone walls. The air was perfumed faintly with the remnants of candle soot and smoke, a lingering scent from last night's opulent revels, still clinging to every tapestry and wall sconce. Amid that profound stillness, the narrator's voice drifted through the scene, as gentle as a lullaby. Before you nestle deeper into your cozy blankets, please press like and subscribe if you truly enjoy this content. And do share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see global company gathered in these quiet hours. In that moment, the invitation fluttered through the viewer's mind like a soft breeze, gracefully beckoning them to embark upon a nocturnal journey. The lanterns cast a muted golden glow as the ceiling fan began its gentle hum, weaving a sonic tapestry designed to soothe the senses. This was not merely an introduction. It was a ritualistic prelude to a restful state. Dim the lights, switch on the fan, allow every sense to drift slowly towards slumber. As the screen faded gradually to black, only the soft susurrus of ambient sound remained, encouraging the audience to let their bodies relax and their minds wander back into memory. At that precise moment, the camera glided into Queen Elizabeth I's bedchamber. Renowned for her restless nights waking through the watches, counting breath after breath, Elizabeth lay in her bed, its plush furs offering cold comfort against the ache of exhaustion that creased her features. It was not grotesque phantoms of childhood memories or the creak of wooden floorboards that haunted her nocturnal hours, but the weight of expectation itself. Each strand of her hair, each line marked by fatigue, bore witness to the unforgiving scrutiny of the court. Even the smallest stir could spark rumour. The Queen looks weary. Her age shows. Thus, the instant Elizabeth opened her eyes, she understood one immutable truth. Her body no longer belonged solely to herself. Every inhalation was a question of authority. Every fleeting expression carried the heft of politics. The bedchamber, once a sanctuary for sorrow, had become the launching point for a reluctant performance. A transformation from a vulnerable woman to a sovereign icon. In that first hush before dawn's full embrace, as Elizabeth braced herself for another day of regal pageantry, she stood at the threshold between night's fragile peace and the relentless march of duty. Draped in the silent opulence of her surroundings, she was at once both the weary occupant of that quiet chamber and the formidable monarch whose every breath and gesture shaped history. And in those first moments, long before the world beyond those walls stirred, the true endurance of her reign was tested not by battlefield or battlement, but by the intimate ritual of a ruler who could never again simply be herself. When the first light of dawn was but a pale whisper against the walls, the Queen's chamber remained bathed in soft shadows. Queen Elizabeth I did not tremble at childhood spectres or the creak of oaken doors in the night. Her deepest fear lay in the unseen eyes that watched from palace corridors. Each morning she faced that invisible monster, the scrutiny of her appearance, the appraisal of her countenance, the silent commentary on every line and contour, those subtle betrayals of fatigue, the hints of weakness, the faint suggestions of mortality. To open her eyes was never merely to return to the waking world, but to ascend onto a vast stage of expectation. No moment of tranquil transition awaited her. Instead, She was swept directly into a grand and solemn ritual, one fraught with the tension of performance. An attendant would slip quietly through the door, placing the bolster just so, setting a basin of water at the bedside. The rustle of linen, the soft clink of metal against metal, all heralded the imminent commencement of her daily metamorphosis. From that instant, Elizabeth ceased to be a woman whose heart pulsed with ordinary rhythms. She became the very embodiment of sovereign authority. She might let her gaze wander absently to the tapestries adorning the walls, each stitch a tale of hunts and battles in ages past. But in the half-light, these scenes blurred into abstract shapes that mirrored her own conflicted spirit, caught between brilliance and exhaustion. Every step in the preparation unfolded with meticulous care. The bath cloth was steeped in herbs known for their purifying properties: rosemary, sage, and lavender, meant to ward off illness. A touch of vinegar, diluted just enough, served as a potent antiseptic. A spritz of rosewater followed, its delicate fragrance a subtle veil against the harsher tang of medicinal vinegar. Water, which one might assume to be a cleansing balm, here proved a double-edged sword. To open the pores was to invite danger. Thus, Elizabeth permitted only the gentlest contact with water, maintaining a wary distance between herself and potential harm. Next came the ritual of oral care. Years of indulgence in sugar-laden delicacies had taken their toll, leaving her teeth brittle and her gums tender. A cloth moistened with vinegar or fortified wine was pressed and rubbed across her aching jaw. Occasionally, a drop or two of clove oil would be applied to the inflamed gum, offering a fleeting numbness against the persistent ache. Each morning's first bite of bread or sip of watered wine was a concession to pain, a humble admission that even a queen must yield to suffering. Yet in the eyes of her attendants, no sympathy was afforded, only the unspoken duty to preserve the radiant smile that was her most formidable weapon. As the attendants moved with silent precision, Elizabeth's room filled with the faint hiss of damp fabric and the subtle aroma of herbs steeped in vinegar. She remained seated, her posture a study in regal restraint, for any slouch or wince could be exploited by those who watched. In that liminal space between slumber and day, she was both prisoner and monarch, bound by the needs of her body and the mandates of her crown. Following the oral cleansing, the process of dressing for the day began. A shift of fine linen was drawn over her weary frame, followed by the stay's corset-like supports woven with whalebone. Each lace was tightened just so, sculpting her torso into the silhouette of authority, yet constricting every breath. Her breath became measured, deliberate, as though each inhalation were a gift to be rationed carefully. Over the stays came the farthingale, a hoop skirt that added breadth and majesty to her form, transforming her into a living emblem of Tudor power. The weight of fabric and structure was substantial, an unspoken testament to the burden she bore. Once her foundation garments were secured, layers of sumptuous brocade and velvet were drawn up the length of her body, each piece adorned with embroidery of gold thread and encrusted with pearls. A stiff, starched ruff encircled her neck, framing her painted face like the halo of an icon. Hair, teased and powdered to a metallic sheen, was woven into a high coiffure that reached toward the rafters, a silent declaration of her unyielding will. The final touch was a delicate crown or jeweled cap, fixed in place to complete the transformation. The room, once a place of rest, had become an ornate workshop where the queen was remade into perfection. Throughout this elaborate dance of garments and powders, Elizabeth's expression remained serene, though each element pressed upon her flesh, corset tight against her ribs, farthingale brushing the floor, ruff scratching her collarbone served as a reminder of the body that she sacrificed for her station. In the hush of that chamber, every rustle of silk and soft click of bone against bone echoed like the beating of a distant drum, heralding the start of her day's performance. And then, as the final ribbon was tied and the last clasp fastened, Elizabeth rose from her dressing chair. She stood fully arrayed, an imperious figure whose form commanded both awe and reverence. Her reflection in the polished mirror was not of a weary woman, but of a timeless sovereign. Each line and wrinkle erased beneath layers of white lead, each ache concealed by the armor of her gown, she looked upon herself with a knowing detachment. The mask of power complete, the woman within safely hidden. When at last the chamber doors opened to admit the watchers, courtiers, and advisers assembled beyond the threshold, Elizabeth advanced with deliberate grace. Every step was a testament to her indomitable spirit and the silent vow she had made to never falter. In that quiet dawn, before the world's eyes fell upon her, she was both performer and audience, a solitary figure cloaked in the sacred trappings of monarchy. Thus began another day in the life of a queen whose truest battleground lay not in distant fields, but within these walls, where each sunrise demanded that she transform her own vulnerability into an enduring spectacle of power. And as she moved to greet her subjects, the shadows of the night's toil were banished, leaving only the luminous icon poised to shape the destiny of a nation. Even when the ritual of bodily cleansing and dental care had drawn to a close, the Queen remained bound by the subtle chains of makeup. Queen Elizabeth I settled before her great gilded mirror, the surface still misted from the steam of her morning wash. Beside her lay the collection of small jars filled with the notorious white substance known as suze, a paste of white lead and vinegar prized for its aesthetic transformation, yet infamous for its silent toxicity. An attendant approached with reverent care, dipping a soft brush into the chalky mixture and laying down the first fragile layer across the Queen's forehead. Each sweep of the brush smoothed away a furrow, each dab filled in a fine line evidence of a mortal woman's weariness. Elizabeth sat motionless, her eyes half closed, as the attendant worked the paste into every contour. The hollow beneath her cheekbone, the soft divots at the corners of her eyes, the faint creases when she remembered sleepless nights. In the half-light, each stroke of white dissolved the visible marks of age, replacing them with the illusion of untarnished marble. Yet Elizabeth was keenly aware of the irony. This very substance, eaten into her skin day by day, etched beneath its deceptive sheen, a record of decay and inflammation that no onlooker would ever see. With the foundation complete, she turned to her lips. A separate attendant, chosen for delicate hands and a steady nerve, mixed the deep vermilion pigment from cinnabar. A fine brush, laden with the crimson paste, traced the outline of Elizabeth's mouth, depositing each drop of colour as if it were liquid blood on alabaster stone. The hue was startlingly vibrant, a sharp contrast to the deathly pallor of her souse mask, making her appear almost animated in the silent hush of her private chamber. Despite the knowledge that mercury lurked within the pigment, threatening to seep into her skin and blood, Elizabeth permitted the colour's brilliance. Every stroke of rouge served a purpose: to project vitality where none might truly exist, to guard her throne with an artifice of youth and strength. Next came the elaborate process of hair preparation. The Queen's own hair, now thinned and fragile with time, was brushed and smoothed before being bound tightly atop her head. Over it, the attendant fitted carefully wrought hairpieces crafted from copper-toned curls, each section secured with minute combs and pins. Interwoven among the strands were pearls and gemstones that caught what little light filtered through the curtained windows, scattering flecks of shimmer across the chamber. The weight of the hairpiece was considerable, pressing down upon Elizabeth's scalp and heating the air around her neck. It itched and tugged at her skin, but she endured it in dignified silence, for the image it created was inseparable from her authority. Once the powdered whiteness, the vermilion smile, and the bejeweled coiffure were in place, the final accessories were applied. A thin gauze veil, almost imperceptible in its gauzy fineness, was draped over her shoulders. Gloves dipped in rose water and musk were pulled onto her hands, sealing in fragrance that clung to her fingertips. Bottles of ambergris, sandalwood, and bergamot offered a layered complexity to her aura. A single breath released a cloud of scent designed to mask any trace of human fragility. Each inhalation, each subtle movement, an outstretched hand, a soft flick of the wrist, sent tendrils of perfume drifting across the chamber. A gentle but unmistakable barrier between sovereign and subject. At long last, the makeup, the hairpiece, and the perfumes had done their work. Elizabeth rose from her dressing chair and regarded the reflection that looked back at her. In the mirror stood a figure both luminous and remote. Skin the colour of porcelain, lips the hue of fresh scarlet, hair piled high like a crown unto itself, every curve and line deliberately fashioned to evoke awe. The faintest haze of rose and amber still curled in the air around her, a fragrant testament to her calculated transformation. Behind that flawless facade lay the hidden woman, the one who bore the nightly aches of a fragile body, who endured the burn of lead paste on her cheeks, who silenced her cough and clenched her jaw against the ache of her teeth. But none of that remained visible. The person reflected in the polished glass was Gloriana immortal, untouchable, transcendent. For the chamber door would soon open to admit courtiers and council, ambassadors and ladies in waiting, all eager to glimpse the perfected image of royalty. And so, with a final, measured breath, Elizabeth smoothed the front of her gown, tilted her chin ever so slightly, and prepared to step beyond that gilded mirror. The vestige of the woman herself was left behind in the soft glow of candlelight, a faint shadow on the stone floor, while the Queen, pure and unbroken, emerged in full regalia. In that moment, history paused to look upon her mask of power, and inside that mask, the real wearer found a fleeting solace in the perfection of her own concealment. Even as the final tendrils of perfume settled in the quiet air, Elizabeth knew that her transformation was far from complete. The true labor of the morning lay in the garments that would encase her form like armor, far more oppressive than any layer of powder or paint. First came the simplest piece, yet a foundation infinitely important. A shift of the purest white linen, soft against her skin. It felt like a gentle whisper, compared to the coarse tapestry of royal life that lay ahead. It was the one garment that still offered a modicum of comfort to her parched and weary flesh, a thin veil between her vulnerable body and the heavier structures to come. Next, the attendant produced the stays an intricate corset framed with the bones of the great whale. Elizabeth stood motionless while the laces were threaded through tiny eyelets, each pull drawing the garment tighter around her torso. The sound of the laces being drawn was like the steady tightening of fate itself, each tug an incision into her own flesh, crafting her into a living statue of regal poise. The stays constricted her waist, lifted her chest, held her spine rigidly straight, and turned each breath into a measured ritual. With every tightened loop, any remaining softness of her body was gradually eradicated, leaving only the sculpted silhouette of a monarch whose very posture proclaimed command. Once her torso was encased in unyielding bone, the farthingale was brought forward a cage-like hoop skirt, again woven with whalebone, designed to flare her silhouette into a bell shape of immense proportions. As the attendant slipped the hoops over her stays and arranged them to expand evenly, Elizabeth could feel the weight settle against her hips. The fabric brushed the wooden floor with a definitive thud, a percussive echo in the cavernous chamber. Each step she took tested the limits of her physical endurance. Her first movements felt like a march across endless marble, demanding exertion yet demanding grace above all. The farthingale declared, without words, that she would not be confined by mere human proportions. Her power must extend in every direction. The next layer was the brocaded gown itself, rich velvet dyed in deep hues and embroidered with threads of gold and silver. Pearls, so numerous they might have been mistaken for dewdrops at dawn, were hand-sewn into the bodice. Gems of finest cut caught the candlelight, scattering prismatic colour across the folds of fabric. The gown required the assistance of 3 attendants to lift and arrange its voluminous skirts, to smooth its elaborate pleats, to pin its trailing sleeves just so. Each stitch symbolized authority, each ornamental motif, an assertion of dynastic legacy. As Elizabeth raised her arms to accommodate the wide sleeves, she could feel the tapestry of her realm drape itself across her shoulders in living form. Then, with a practiced hand, an attendant placed the stiff, starched ruff around her neck. It was a collar of wire and linen, expertly frilled into an ornate halo. The ruff's edges brushed the lower part of her cheeks, framing her painted visage as if she were a saint captured in stained glass. Though it pricked the tender skin of her neck, Elizabeth did not flinch. To expose discomfort would be to admit her humanity, and she stood determined to remain an icon of unassailable dignity. The ruff marked the boundary between woman and monarch, between flesh and symbol, compelling her head to remain poised high. Finally, the attendant draped her in a mantle of velvet, its interior lined with ermine. The fabric's sumptuous weight settled heavily on her shoulders, a tactile affirmation of the burdens she bore. A jeweled clasp, shaped like a blooming rose, secured the mantle at her throat. Beneath the mantle, her bodice and farthingale remained hidden, yet their shapes persisted in every contour of her figure. She felt as if she were encased in centuries of expectation, each garment a chapter in a story of unbroken lineage, each accessory an assertion of England's sovereignty under her rule. As she looked upon herself in the full-length mirror, Elizabeth saw not the woman who awoke with aches and fears, but a living emblem of monarchy, a figure carved from bone and brocade, painted and perfumed, lifted by wire, secured by lace, and encircled by pearls. The transformation was complete. Nothing of the private self remained visible. In that singular reflection, she embodied the promise of eternal youth, unwavering authority, and the divine right to rule. Each fold of cloth, each glittering gem, each frill of linen stood as silent testimony to the sacrifices she made for her crown. And yet, beneath that imperious facade, Elizabeth felt the faintest tremor of life. Her heartbeat, still hers, muted by layers of armor. Her breath, a soft exhalation choked by stays and ruff. Her mind, lingering in the liminal space between slumber and day. She took a final, measured breath, steeling herself for the world waiting outside. Then, with one last, deliberate adjustment of her gown, she stepped away from the mirror. The chamber doors would soon swing open. The hush would be replaced by the murmur of awaiting courtiers, and the morning's audience would begin. But in that fleeting, tranquil moment before the performance, Elizabeth allowed herself to feel the weight of each garment anew. The cold canvas of linen next to her skin, the rigid cage of whalebone pressing her into form, the lush velvet reminding her that power could be as heavy as the world itself. Thus adorned, she was ready, not as a woman, but as Gloriana, the living sculpture of a nation's hopes, clad in bone and silk, ascending to greet the dawn. When her attire was finally complete, the true spectacle of the day began. The morning audience. The heavy oak doors to her chamber swung quietly inward, and a procession of courtiers passed through the threshold, ministers in dark robes, foreign ambassadors in rich silks, and nobles bearing the brittle weight of rank. This morning gathering was not merely an exchange of affairs of state, but a political liturgy in which power was both declared and reaffirmed. Elizabeth, still ensconced in her layers of brocade and hoops, sat erect upon her portable throne, the folds of her silk skirts arranged like ripples in a still pond. Every deliberate motion, her faint, knowing smile, the measured nod, the sudden narrowing of her brow was observed with meticulous attention. A single approving glance could lift a petition from obscurity to favor. A slight wave of her hand might consign a hopeful plea to oblivion. She spoke seldom, preferring the subtle dialogues of eye and silence. When she held her gaze upon a supplicant without word or gesture, the hush that followed was enough to unnerve the boldest among them. Her eyes, icy yet luminous, communicated volumes in the pregnant pauses she cultivated. Despite the agony of her constrained ribs, the sharpened pinch of whalebone stays cutting into her flesh, and the relentless pressure of her farthingale upon her lungs, Elizabeth retained an air of unruffled dignity. Before her a simple tray of morning sustenance awaited: coarse, crusty bread, a cup of watered ale, a small plate of salted fish or cold game. These modest victuals served as her daily ritual of survival. An ever-watchful attendant tasted each morsel to guard against poison before presenting it to the Queen. Elizabeth lifted the trencher to her lips, breaking off small fragments of bread as deliberately as if conducting a ceremony. Each chew rang in the quiet chamber, like the tapping of gavel on a judge's bench, a soft thud affirming her resilience. As she nibbled at the bread and sipped the ale, the attendants and petitioners looked on. The Queen's every bite was a study in controlled nourishment, as though she and the court were bound in a shared understanding that food itself was both lifeline and liability. If she hesitated, their hopes would tremble. If she partook freely, they would understand that her health remained unassailable, at least in appearance. In truth, each swallow was a confrontation with her own fragility, a reminder that the body beneath the royal robes was subject to the same pangs and aches as any other. The chamber was thick with fragrance, a layered veil of rose, ambergris, and sandalwood that curled through the air like spectral tendrils. Every breath Elizabeth drew carried that perfumed cloak, isolating her from the sense of human skin, and whispered fears that flooded the corridors beyond. Those who stepped too close risked swooning in the heady cloud of musk. Yet the very luxury of the scent, an artificial barrier between monarch and mortal, also concealed a more intimate vulnerability. Beneath the veils of perfume lay the faint undercurrent of her own body's distress. The coppery tang of weakened blood, the subtle odour of ailment that no amount of rose could fully mask. When her simple repast was concluded, the ambassadors and nobles withdrew in order of precedence, their silken cloaks rustling like autumn leaves as they filed from the chamber. The doors closed softly behind them, leaving Elizabeth suspended in a tranquil hush. For a heartbeat, the only sounds were the faint rustle of her skirt settling and the muted drip of candle wax. In that solitude, she sat among the spoils of her nightly transformation, glazed white lead on her cheeks, vermilion staining her lips, the rigid hoops beneath her gown pressing against her every breath. Here, in this moment of afterglow, she contemplated the paradox of her existence. The more exalted her status, the more thoroughly she had to conceal the frailty that pulsed within. Power demanded a flawless visage. Vulnerability was a threat to sovereignty. As her attendants quietly began to remove the furred cloak and velvet mantle one by one, Elizabeth reflected on the cost of each stitch and every jeweled clasp. There was comfort in the routine, comfort in the predictable ache, the familiar pressure of bone and fabric, but also a profound loneliness. Her chamber, once a sanctuary, had been transmuted into a stage upon which she performed her own myth. The walls bore witness to her daily resurrection and burial of the woman who awoke each dawn with bones that ached and nerves that quivered. Outside those walls, the machinery of state whirred with petitions, councils, and councils within councils. But inside, she faced only her reflection and the soft murmur of servants gathering her discarded regalia. As each layer of her armour was stowed away, the ruff carefully unbound, the farthingale unhooped, the stays uncinched, Elizabeth allowed herself to feel the tremor of relief as the constriction eased. The layers returned to storage chests in neat, shadowed rows, as though she were disrobing for the night rather than preparing for the day. Beneath the linen shift, her skin bore the faintest impressions of bone whale bone arcs and metal wire rings pressed like the memory of a too-tight embrace. In the quiet aftermath, she wondered at the nature of her own endurance. Was it resilience or resignation that allowed her to don those garments each morning? Was the ritual rebirth of the Queen, day after day, a triumph over human weakness or a slow succumbing to the necessity of illusion? She closed her eyes, listening to the distant echo of the court beyond, feeling the last flickers of perfumed warmth fade into the cooler air of her chamber. For a final moment, she sat alone, suspended between two selves, the woman who bore the pain of living and the icon who bore the weight of history. In her solitude, Elizabeth found both sorrow and solace. Sorrow for the self she could no longer inhabit without artifice. Solace in the knowledge that, for as long as she could stand within that chamber, draped in silk and steel, her authority remained as steadfast as the stone walls around her. When at last she rose, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, the Queen stepped into the stream of duty once more. The ritual of the morning had concluded, but the rhythms of power would pulse on in endless succession. And though the garments lay folded in darkness, their imprints lingered upon her body, a testament to the nightly sacrifices demanded by a crown that could not tolerate the faintest whisper of its wearer's mortality. After the simple morning meal was finished, Queen Elizabeth experienced no true moment of rest. The heavy oak doors to her chamber clicked shut behind the departing attendants, yet the air remained thick with invisible gazes. She could almost hear them counting the echoes of her steps, measuring her breaths, noting the slightest tremor in her posture. For a fraction of a breath, the only living soul in the room was herself, a woman weary to her core, her spine still aching beneath the constriction of the stays she had worn for hours, her scalp tender from the weight and heat of the wig, her jaw still pulsing from the persistent throb of an untreated toothache. A small, lacquered table by the window bore silent testimony to the burdens of sovereignty. Upon it lay a neat stack of correspondence, dispatches from distant provinces, each one heavy with the weight of governance. The Governor of Ireland's letter detailed unrest along the western shore, a tapestry of clashing loyalties and scarce resources. A missive from the Lord High Admiral's office reported on the slow progress of shipbuilding, where oak timbers lay in piles and skilled carpenters were all too few. A third document, a memorandum of tax revenues from the recent harvest, charted the lifeblood of the realm in cold, precise figures. In the stillness, the quiet rip of parchment as Elizabeth slit the seal sounded like a sombre gong, reminding her that a monarch's duty brooked no delay. Seated upright in the pale morning light, Elizabeth leaned forward, magnifying glass in hand, poring over each word with the intensity of a scholar and the urgency of a commander. The lens made her eyes appear larger, rimmed with fatigue, yet alight with keen focus. Every numeral and title held the power to alter destiny's lives of farmers and merchants, the morale of soldiers, the hopes of families dependent on the stability of the crown. For a fleeting instant, her gaze lifted from the pages, and those who might have glimpsed her would have seen the weary spark of loneliness shining in her eyes. Surrounded by grandeur, she was profoundly alone. No soul beyond those walls truly comprehended the physical and emotional toll exacted by her unceasing vigilance. In the quiet recesses of her mind, Elizabeth allowed herself a whisper of self-questioning. Did the copper tones of her elaborate wig lend her the strength to confront the world? Did the white lead on her cheeks armor her against her own doubts? Perhaps in this solitary moment, unobserved and unhurried, she could simply be herself. A woman whose body ached and whose heart trembled at the enormity of her responsibilities. Yet the fragile refuge of introspection was fleeting. The machinery of state demanded her return to the role of living symbol, the instant her private thoughts dared to wander. With a soft sigh, almost inaudible against the hush of the chamber, she slid the magnifying glass aside. Carefully, she gathered the dispatched letters, folding each one back into its parchment envelope. The governor's seal was set aside for her personal reply. The admiral's report would be marked for immediate consultation with her council. The tax returns would be noted and filed. Each folded letter was a covenant she made with her office, that she would not waver, that she would not relinquish the control these words represented. Rising from her seat, Elizabeth's limbs protested, a reminder that her body bore the aches she so deftly concealed. She smoothed the front of her brocade dress with gentle fingertips, reassuring herself of the solidity of the fabric that clung to the stays beneath. The farthingale's hoops whispered against the wood floor as she stepped lightly toward her writing desk. A quill sat poised in an inkpot, the feathered plume damp from the last stroke she had made, preparing instructions for her treasurer. With one last glance at the letters awaiting her signature, Elizabeth took a deep breath, as though drawing purpose from the very air of her chamber. Even in this brief interval between tasks, the kingdom's needs pressed upon her. The faces of her subjects, from the fishermen of Cornwall to the scholars of Cambridge, flickered before her mind's eye. Each petition she had received, each rumour whispered in the corridors, each complaint muttered by weary villagers, fell upon her senses like a relentless tide. Her solitude was, paradoxically, the crucible in which her resolve was tempered. Though weary and frail in flesh, she stood as the enduring vessel of national will. With measured movements, she sat once more at the desk, removed a fresh sheet of parchment, and began to write. Her script, now as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, formed loops and flourishes that belied the seriousness of her words. She penned replies that would bolster the governor's troops, instructions to expedite the gathering of oak for the admiral's fleet, and reassurances that the burdens of taxation would be borne with fairness in mind. Each word laid a brick in the foundation of her rule, each signature an affirmation of her commitment to steer her realm through uncertainty. As the ink dried on the parchment, Elizabeth paused, dipping her quill in her inkwell once more. In the dim light, she allowed a silent prayer, that the efforts of her hands and the strategies of her mind might suffice to hold the kingdom's fragile balance. Outside, the palace grounds had stirred to life-distant clatter of hooves, the low murmur of heralds, the soft rustle of silken trains sweeping over marble floors. The world beyond her door awaited her commands, her judgment, her very presence to shape its course. Reluctantly, she set down her quill and stood. Each step toward the chamber door brought her body closer to the weight of expectation. The cloak of night had lifted, and though her morning had been filled with the solace of private reflection, there was no escaping her role. No matter the aches in her bones or the weariness in her soul, Queen Elizabeth would once again don the mantle of sovereign, a living symbol to whom every eye in the realm was turned. In that brief lull between solitude and ceremony, she had surrendered her fleeting moment of humanity in exchange for the unyielding demands of power. Yet, in her heart, she carried the memory of her own vulnerability like a precious secret, a reminder that behind the crown, the stays, and the intricate rituals, there beat a real mortal heart, determined to reign and endure. Barely had Elizabeth set aside the final missive when a soft rap at the door announced her Privy Council's arrival. She smoothed the folds of her bell-shaped skirt one last time, then lifted the hem of her heavy mantle and glided toward the low-hung portal. Beyond stood her most trusted advisors, the principal ministers in their weighty robes, and the privy councillors, positioned in strict order of precedence. Their faces were solemn, their postures rigid, each bearing the unspoken gravity of the realm upon their shoulders. As the door creaked open, Elizabeth stepped into the antechamber, the ghostly glow of dawn filtering through tall mullioned windows. The trailing velvet of her gown whispered against the flagstones, and her powdered cheeks and freshly stained lips still gleamed from the morning's ritual. For one heartbeat she allowed herself a moment's relief, but then her gaze, both warm and incisive, swept over the assembly, reminding them that even in familiar surroundings, she remained sovereign. They followed her into the council chamber, a vaulted room hung with tapestries depicting ancient glories and embroidered battles. At the raised dais sat the presiding clerk, inkpot and quill at the ready. A hush fell as the Queen took her seat upon the ornately carved chair draped in scarlet cloth, her skirt fanning out like a halo of brocade. The Earl of Norfolk, tall and resolute, rose first. Clearing his throat, he presented his summary of the Scottish border situation in measured tones. He spoke of troop dispositions and forage supplies, lamenting that royal forces were stretched thin and stores were running low. As he outlined the need for reinforcements, Elizabeth listened with composure, her slight nods serving as both encouragement and omnipresent scrutiny. Yet behind those gentle acknowledgments lay a warning. Any hint of negligence would be met with swift censure. Next, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs stepped forward, parchment in hand. He unfolded a detailed memorandum concerning a proposed alliance with the French crown. The plan, he explained, involved ceding Calais in exchange for a binding peace treaty, a bold gambit meant to secure maritime trade routes and preempt continental hostilities. Elizabeth's pale face, framed by her powdered hair and ruffled collar, betrayed a flicker of contemplation. She leaned forward, fingertips pressed together, and regarded the advisor with a calculated calm. When he finished, the chamber remained silent, as though the very walls awaited her response. She allowed a moment to pass, then spoke in her clear, measured tone, asking for further elucidation on the long-term implications for English merchants and the stability of her westerly ports. The advisor flushed slightly, astonished by her precise inquiries, but he recovered and provided the clarifications she sought. Then came the mention of the royal treasury's dwindling coffers. The treasurer read aloud the year's revenues, noting that several shires had delivered less than expected due to poor harvests, and that recent military expenditures had outstripped reserves. At the first vague assurance that funds would be forthcoming by month's end, Elizabeth interrupted with a steady voice. She requested an itemized breakdown of each levy, the exact dates and amounts collected, and the expenditures made in each quarter. "I require precise figures," she intoned, "not assurances born of hope." The clerk's pen paused over parchment, and even the candles seemed to flicker in sudden tension. Council members exchanged furtive glances, their composure strained by the Queen's insistence on transparency. None dared to equivocate under her gaze, for they knew that any evasion would be met with her sharpest rebuke. As her questions drilled deeper, the air in the room grew taut. The noble who managed the customs accounts stumbled over his figures, prompting Elizabeth to issue a mild censure. "We must not allow inaccuracy to fester," she said softly, yet her tone carried the weight of authority. "Our subjects deserve certainty, and our allies demand reliability." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in, then moved smoothly to the next agenda item. It was a masterful display of both firmness and tact. She had cut through prevarication, without shaming any single man. Rather, she elevated the standards of her council by example, guiding them towards the clarity she demanded. Although the meeting had stretched far beyond its usual hour, Elizabeth's countenance remained unruffled. Her attendants would later remark on how her posture never faltered, how her voice never wavered, even as the council's deliberations grew dense and labyrinthine. She orchestrated the discussion like a conductor shaping a symphony. Questions issued at precisely the right moments, objections received and dissolved with courtesy, instructions given with unmistakable resolve. When the chamber's torches were trimmed low, and the slanted rays of the sun reached the dais, she finally brought the session to a close. Lifting her gloved hand, she declared the meeting concluded, and a collective sigh, half relief, half awe, swept through the assembled men. They filed out in respectful silence, leaving Elizabeth alone once more in the hushed expanse of the council chamber. The tapestries and carved panelling exhaled a solemnness that only royalty could command, and the echo of departing footsteps still lingered like a half-remembered dream. The Queen rose, her skirts brushing velvet against stone, and walked to the window. Beyond lay the palace courtyards, stirring with life servants preparing carriages, guards marching into position, common folk arriving at the gate with petitions in hand. Elizabeth gazed out, her heart both heavy and resolute. She had guided her council through another morning's crucible, balancing authority with deference, steel with silk. She had reaffirmed her sovereignty not with a decree alone, but with the disciplined grace of a ruler who understood that power, once bestowed, must be wielded with unerring precision. In that quiet moment, as the light of late morning crept across the chamber floor, Elizabeth allowed herself to acknowledge both the burdens and the triumphs of her role. The world beyond demanded her presence, her judgments, and her will. Yet within her breast beat a heart that still felt fatigue, that still bore the aches and pangs of the woman beneath the crown. The paradox of her existence, strength and fragility intertwined, remained her most intimate secret. And though the council hall would soon fill again with supplicants and senators, she carried within her the quiet knowledge that, having steered her realm through this morning's trials, she would continue to be both monarch and mortal until the sun finally sank beyond the horizon. When the council's final voices faded down the corridor, Elizabeth found no respite in solitude. She turned once more to the tall, gilded mirror that had borne witness to her every morning transformation. Her reflection stared back with haunting clarity. Cheeks the colour of winter moonlight, lips still painted in vivid scarlet, even as cracks in her powdered veneer betrayed the night's hidden wounds. At her hairline, faint crimson marks revealed where the combs had bitten into tender skin. The wig had been drawn so taut that small sores had bloomed beneath its weight. Around her throat, delicate abrasions bore witness to the whalebone stays that still held her torso in an unrelenting grip. Each fold of silk, each button sewn with deliberate precision, served as a silent reminder of the price she paid for glory. Her eyes lingered on the evidence of her endurance, the faintest flicker of pain igniting behind the regal pose. She clasped a slender wrist, fingertips brushing trace impressions of lace upon her skin, and inhaled deeply. There was no ounce of complaint in her, bearing only the quiet resignation of one who understood that a queen's armour must never be laid aside. With a soft, exhaled sigh, she stepped away from the mirror. Behind her, the chamber seemed to exhale as well, the flicker of candle flames casting dancing shadows upon tapestries that chronicled the triumphs of her ancestors. Guided by memory more than sight, Elizabeth made her way to the narrow balcony that overlooked the palace gardens. The morning air was crisp against her cheeks, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of damp soil and oak leaves. It was a fragrance so far removed from the heady perfumes clinging to her gloves and gown that she almost smiled at its simplicity. For a precious instant, the Queen allowed herself to breathe as a woman rather than as a sovereign, her chest rising freely, unimpeded by stays and farthingale. In that solitary hush, she pictured her childhood, running barefoot through the rose beds of Hampton Court, the laughter of her younger self mingling with birdsong. She recalled lazy afternoons drifting along the Thames, the water's gentle lull a sanctuary from expectation. In such moments, the court had seemed a distant echo, and her family's embrace a place of genuine comfort. But such reveries were always brief. The soft rustle of a servant's footsteps on the stone landing heralded the return of duty. A slip of parchment was presented with careful deference. A missive from the ambassador in Paris was awaiting her review, and preparations for the weekend's royal celebration required her final approval. The Queen's shoulders straightened, the delicate calm of her expression returning in a practiced flash. She had no right to linger in memory when the affairs of state depended on her vigilance. With a steady hand she accepted the papers and allowed the servant to withdraw. The air, once infused with the purity of wood and leaf, now carried the weight of her responsibilities again. Elizabeth made no attempt to hurry, stepping back inside with measured grace, but the momentary window of tranquility had closed. Behind her, the balcony doors swung closed, sealing her within the ornate confines of her chamber. She set the ambassador's letter upon a small writing desk, its seals gleaming like silent sentinels. The celebration she was called to plan would demand speeches and ceremonies, pageantry that must never falter. A crown of youthful myth needed constant polishing, and the machinery of court was already humming at full throttle. Yet Elizabeth's heart felt a familiar ache, the aspiration to cast aside powder and petticoat, to stand once more as the woman she had been before the world claimed her image. Instead, she drew her quill and ink, preparing instructions that would shape alliances and safeguard peace. Each careful flourish of her pen seemed to echo the swift motions of her attendant earlier, lacing stays and tacking pearls. Her handwriting, poised and precise, laid the foundation for treaties and orders that reached from London to far-flung provinces. A single miscalculation could unravel the fragile fabric of stability she had worked so tirelessly to maintain. As she wrote, the quiet click of the inkwell lid and the scratch of quill upon parchment became a chant of sovereignty, renewing her commitment even as exhaustion weighed her limbs. Outside, the palace stirred into midday bustle, voices drifting along corridors, the clatter of horse hooves arriving for latest audiences, the soft creak of armor as guards took their stations. The living pulse of her realm beat on, heedless of her own hidden fatigue. For a fleeting heartbeat, Elizabeth allowed her eyes to drift once more to the balcony beyond the window. The sight of the oaks and their sheltering branches called to her stillness, but duty brooked no hesitation. She dipped her quill to apply the final flourish, sealing her resolve in ink. The last order dispatched, she rose and smoothed the front of her brocade skirt, settling the ruffled collar around her throat. In that gesture lay both the weight of crown and the grace of a woman who had mastered the art of enduring. The chamber felt smaller now, the tapestries pressing in with the weight of history. Elizabeth's reflection in the mirror no longer seemed an exact likeness, but rather a symbol white as marble, red as regal velvet, sculpted by ceremony into an unbreakable form. Yet within that symbol beat a heart that remembered every ache. The ache of bone, the ache of hearth, lost laughter, the ache of solitude behind golden doors. With quiet determination, she stepped away and moved toward the waiting corridors, ready to face another wave of petitions and proclamations. Her steps echoed like a metronome, each footfall a testimony to her unwavering will. The echoes of the morning's council still lingered in her mind, but now her thoughts turned forward, to the ambassador's reply, the banquet seating arrangements, the precise moment she would appear to deliver her opening address. The minutiae of rulership came flooding back, and she welcomed it as both refuge and crucible. Beyond those doors lay a world that depended on her every breath, every gesture, every carefully measured word. There was no room for lingering doubts or tender memories. Elizabeth the Queen would go forth once again, her powdered face, the face of England, her ruby lips, the voice of stability, her heart, though hidden, beating true beneath the layers of cloth and bone. And though the chains of ceremony clung to her flesh, they could never touch the spirit that wore them so steadfastly, even in the soft haze of a day that began with a whisper of rest and quickly became a symphony of power. The palace corridors echoed with the soft tap of polished shoes and the whisper of heavy cloaks brushing stone. As Elizabeth paused for a moment in the hush between audiences, she thought to herself, "Power is a gift that shares its coin with the sentence of loneliness." She had learned this lesson in her earliest days at court, reared among suspicion and hidden daggers. Intrigues blossomed like poisonous flowers behind every tapestry. Whispers of betrayal curled through the corridors like smoke. To survive, she had woven solitude into her armor, letting it shield her from the tempests of politics. Each morning's ritual, from the constriction of stays to the bright veneer of makeup, was a silent struggle between a body weary with aches and a will forged of steel. Smallpox outbreaks, bouts of ague, the relentless burden of empire, Elizabeth had endured more than any sovereign should. Yet she never spoke of the headaches that racked her temples at dawn, or the fevers that crept through her veins in the night. In councils and on the field of state, she presented herself as an unshakable monument. Beneath that mask of white lead and scarlet lips, she drew strength from her solitude, convincing herself that no one could deprive her of authority unless she consented to relinquish faith in her own resolve. Alone in the tapestry-lit chambers, she rehearsed her responses, sharpened her gaze, and steeled her heart against the treacheries that lurked beyond every corridor. Many a night, Elizabeth would awake in a tremor of chill sweat, her pulse feeble as a lamb's bleat. In those dark hours, she would sit up, peeling away the cumbersome layers of her courtly raiment. The stays and farthingale, The ruff and the layer upon layer of brocade all fell away until she stood bare as any commoner, allowing her lungs to fill with the cool, untainted air. In those precious moments, she felt the unaccustomed joy of being merely Elizabeth, a woman with a mortal frame and a tender heart. Yet freedom tasted fleeting. As the chill of dawn crept through the window shutters, she recalled with gentle firmness, "I am queen, and my mission endures." With that thought, she dressed once more in her ceremonial armor, girding herself for the day's demands. From the crucible of her solitude, the queen honed a capacity for decisive judgment that could chill any counselor's blood. She knew that a single moment's hesitation, a slip of courtesy, might unmask her vulnerabilities to eager rivals. Yet paradoxically, it was in this very solitude that she discovered her inner calm, a still well of serenity from which she drew the fortitude to stand unbowed before storm and siege. The silence of her private chambers, punctuated only by the soft rustle of silk and the tick of a distant clock, became the crucible where doubt was tempered into wisdom. Each evening, as the court's bustle faded into twilight, she returned to those halls alone, to sit beneath the heavy tapestries and listen to the echo of her own breathing. There, in the gentle gloom, she found the quiet that replenished her spirit. Thus, within the tapestry of her reign, loneliness was both her shield and her solace. It protected her from the barbs of intrigue, and nurtured the resolve that guided her pen in closed councils. And when dawn broke again, she emerged hair-pinned and powdered, face painted as marble, skirts rustling like distant thunder, ready to once more be the unyielding emblem of her people's hopes. Though her body bore the marks of silent suffering, red sores at the hairline, bruises from the stays, the faint ache of dental pain, her gaze remained luminous, with the quiet power of one who had learned to be alone and thus could never be conquered. In the hush before the palace stirred, Elizabeth treasured that solitude, for it was in her loneliness that she discovered the secret heart of her reign. As dusk fell, Elizabeth returned to her private chamber, the soft glow of candlelight dancing across the walls like drifting spectres. The day's bustle faded behind her, as she eased the door closed with a gentle click. Inside, the familiar array of mirrors and cosmetic vessels greeted her in muted reverence. She approached her dressing table, its polished surface reflecting the flicker of 3 modest candles. One by one, she blew each out until only a single taper remained, its flame wavering in the encroaching gloom. Taking a deep, measured breath, Elizabeth seated herself upon the low stool before the mirror. The leather stays that had bound her torso throughout the day groaned in protest as she gently unfastened their laces, drawing them loose with trembling, yet determined, fingers. Each loop undone released a small sigh of fabric and bone, and with every slackened cord, she felt a fragment of her burden slip away. Next, she turned her focus to the elaborate hairpiece that sat atop her head like a glittering crown. The combs and pins that had secured those copper-hued curls and pearls through countless audiences were eased free, one at a time, from the tense flesh of her scalp. With each pin withdrawn, a tiny flare of relief bloomed across her temple. The cool air of the chamber brushed her skin as the heavy wig was lifted away, revealing her own thin, pale hair tousled, unadorned, and achingly familiar. Her face, still concealed beneath layers of thick white lead, remained closely watched even in this private moment. With a deliberate gentleness, she reached for the soft cloth and the small jar of warm water infused with herbs. She pressed the damp fabric to her forehead, to her cheeks, and to the creases beside her mouth, loosening the powder that had hardened through hours of courtly display. The paste came away in ragged flakes, drifting into the basin with a soft patter. Beneath the souse, her skin bore faint pink traces, where inflammation had taken hold, a testament to the daily ritual's hidden pain. She continued to dab and swirl until the final traces of chalk washed down the drain, revealing once more the pale but living flesh of her cheeks. At last unmade, Elizabeth sat back and allowed the stool to cradle her. Her shoulders, freed from the weight of her velvet mantle, slumped in quiet exhaustion. The folds of her brocade gown pooling around her ankles reminded her that even now she remained bound by role and expectation. She lifted the last stay free from her waist, and as the corset fell away, she felt a sudden hollow where its rigid support had been. The private woman, her true self, seemed to stand before her, fragile in the dim candlelight. In the softened shadows, she reached for her leather-bound journal, its pages worn from countless confidences. The quill, long accustomed to her hand, awaited upon a scattering of ink spots. With a tender brush of her fingertips, she opened to a fresh leaf and read the faint, looping script of earlier entries. Notes on sleepless nights, recollections of distant childhood, prayers for England's peace. Tonight, she would add to those pages the story of this day's final emergence from her armor. Her hand trembled slightly as she dipped the quill into the ink. The first words appeared in graceful arcs. Tonight, I lay aside the mask of power to face the emptiness within. Each pin and ribbon I removed returned me to my own skin, and for a fleeting moment, I was but Elizabeth, a woman of flesh and bone, not the symbol upon which my people set their hopes. She paused and glanced at the candle's wavering flame, its glow casting long, thin shadows across the parchment. A small sigh escaped her lips, the sound of a heart unburdened for an instant. Then she continued, her quill carving fervent phrases into the page. I have lived within walls of suspicion and ambition, learning that solitude is the shield that preserves the crown. Yet in this solitude, I have also found a stillness of spirit that sustains me through courtly storms. The world demands I stand unbroken, but it is in my moments alone that I gather the strength to remain so. Her words slowed as memories of her youth drifted through her mind. The laughter of siblings echoing in Hampton Court's verdant gardens, the gentle lull of Thames waters against its banks, the warmth of her mother's embrace before the world's weight fell upon her shoulders. She wrote of these recollections with a tender sorrow, acknowledging that they were the sweetest salve against the isolating precision of her daily duties. Beneath the swirl of candle wax and ink, Elizabeth pressed her lips to the paper and offered a final reflection. A sovereign must guide her people, but she must also guide herself through the long, lonely hours. To rule is to bear both the mantle of authority and the solitude of command. Power may lift me above the fray, but it demands that I sacrifice fragments of my own humanity. She laid down the quill and closed the journal with a soft snap, careful not to disturb the fragile hush of her chamber. Reaching for the single remaining candle, she struck a match against the box and brought the tiny blaze to its wick. The room brightened just enough for her to see her reflection once more, unencumbered by lead, lace, or pearl. Her hair, tumbled and stray, framed her face with a softness that no courtly coiffure could rival. Her eyes, still luminous beneath faint shadows of fatigue, gazed back with quiet resolve. With a weary but determined smile, Elizabeth whispered to the flickering flame, "Tomorrow I shall attire myself anew in mask and armour. I will lace the stays, don the colours, and paint a face of marble and rose. Yet I will also carry within me this still moment of truth, for it is the root from which my strength grows." She allowed her smile to linger, fragile yet steadfast, before extinguishing the candle with a gentle breath. In the gentle darkness that followed, Queen Elizabeth rose from her stool. The knight's armour had been shed. Her body felt lighter, her spirit unburdened. Clutching the journal to her chest, she crossed the chamber and slipped beneath her canopy bed's velvet drapes. As she lay upon the soft rushes strewn across the floor, her final thought drifted softly. Here, in the sanctuary of sleep, I am simply Elizabeth, untouched by crown or court, yet ever ready to bear both. With that gentle assurance, her eyes closed at last, and the day's last candle burned low until it too succumbed to darkness. Late in the still hours of the night, the palace was far from a sanctuary of rest. Queen Elizabeth I often awoke in the small hours, her forehead slick with cold sweat, her heart pounding like a war drum. In the enveloping darkness, she would lie silent for a moment, listening to the slow creak of the floorboards beyond her door, the distant guard's patrol, and the steady echo of her own breath. Then, with deliberate care, she sat up and began to shed the layers of authority that pressed upon her body. She loosened the stays first, untying each taut ribbon until the whalebone frame sighed and released its hold on her ribs. Next, she reached above to the ornate combs and pins holding the copper-hued wig in place. One by one, each pin slid free, and the heavy curls tumbled around her shoulders like a cascade of autumn leaves, leaving her scalp cool and aching in turns. In those moments, the palace felt hushed and reverent. No rustle of silken gowns, no distant footfalls, only the soft rush of air drawn into her lungs and the frantic rhythm of her own heart. Elizabeth bent to grasp her stays and wig, laying them aside with a tender reverence for the trappings they represented. They had served her all day as armour against scrutiny, but now, relinquished, they lay like discarded burdens on the rush-strewn floor. Yet it was not only the weight of her garments that tormented her. An intermittent fever gnawed at her constitution, flaring up in feverish pulses that left her breathless. At times, she leaned heavily against the bed's carved oak headboard, closing her eyes to stave off the vertigo that threatened to overwhelm her. Each quivering heartbeat reminded her that, despite the crown upon her brow, she was flesh and blood, vulnerable to the same malady that afflicted her common subjects. She pressed her fingertips against her temples, willing the world to still, to slow down, so that she might find purchase against the whirl of heat and ache within her. When the fever grew too fierce, one of her most trusted attendants, always tapped for such duties, was permitted entrance. In the hush of the room, the servant moved with careful precision, carrying a small bowl of warm water infused with vinegar and calming herbs. A cloth was soaked, wrung of excess, and pressed gently to the Queen's forehead, then to her temples and cheeks. The vinegar's tang stung Her Majesty's skin, but the coolness offered a brief reprieve from the fever's flame. As the cloth warmed and dried, Elizabeth remained still, her back against the oak, eyes half-lidded, in surrender to the moment's relief. Yet when the cloth was lifted and the coolness faded, her cheeks remained uncomfortably hot, the residue of white lead from her morning cosmetics stinging wherever it had penetrated pore or crease. In the dim candlelight, the Queen's thoughts drifted to the coming dawn. Anxiety settled in her chest like a stone. How would her courtiers receive her? Would the fever's toll betray itself in the shadows under her eyes? Would the faint tremor in her voice echo through the vaulted hall as weakness? She thought of the foreign ambassadors awaiting her counsel, the domestic ministers ready to probe her judgments, and the multitude of petitions that would flood her presence chamber. Each plan for the next day, treaties to sign, tax reforms to consider, military reinforcements to dispatch, loomed heavy in her mind, demanding clarity even as her body threatened to betray her composure. Despite the ache in her bones, Elizabeth managed a faint, wry smile. "No one must see me falter," she whispered into the silence. The words barely disturbed the air, yet they carried the full weight of her resolve. To her subjects, she had to remain the unbroken sovereign, the bright symbol of stability amid Europe's storms. Even in her weakest hour, she would not yield the mantle of her reign. As the fever began to ebb, she reached for the small journal placed on a narrow side table. The quill and ink still gleamed invitingly in the candle's dying glow. With slow, thoughtful movements, she opened to a clean page and allowed the pen to trace the contours of her solitary ordeal. The ink flowed in steady lines. "Tonight, many admire the brilliance of my day, yet they cannot fathom this nightly battle with my own flesh. Power shines like the noon sun, but no one sees the cost invisible to all but the soul that pays it. In the depths of these hours, I am not the monarch beloved by my people, but a woman besieged by fever and doubt. Do not imagine that authority alone spares me pain." Her hand paused, lingering over the last word. The candle guttered, casting wavering shadows across her face. A soft tremor travelled through her pen as she weighed her next lines. "Let this record stand for those who come after me. A queen's crown may outlast her body, but it does so only through quiet sacrifices unseen by any but the lonely heart that wears it." She closed the journal gently, the page whispering shut like a small secret kept safe in the night. The room's single candle shared its light with the quill, beckoning her one final moment of clarity. Elizabeth held the pen aloft, gazing at its feathered tip, as though drawing strength from its poised elegance. Then, with a decisive exhale, she placed it back upon the table and rose, her limbs unsteady but her spirit rekindled. With unhurried grace, she stepped toward the bed and allowed herself to be guided beneath the heavy velvet folds once more. The rushes beneath were cool against her naked skin, as different from her brocaded gowns as night was from day. She drew the canopy closed against the last flickers of candlelight. In that almost complete darkness, Elizabeth lay down, folding her arms over her chest in a gesture reminiscent of the stance she took before her council each morning. The aches of fever and fatigue pressed upon her. The quiet echo of her heartbeat resonated in her ears like distant drums. Before sleep claimed her, she offered one final thought to the night. When the dawn comes, I will don my armor again, my stays, my wig, my paint, and emerge as the unyielding symbol my realm requires. But in this vulnerable hour, I am Elizabeth, and this body, however frail, is mine to tend. With that silent vow, she closed her eyes, the heady mixture of relief and resolve threading through her mind like a lullaby, lulling her into the deep slumber she so rarely allowed herself to embrace. Early the next morning, long before the pale fingers of dawn fully touched the sky, Elizabeth rose once again to her elaborate ritual of transformation. Today, the stakes were higher. A grand banquet awaited, intended to impress foreign dignitaries and cement alliances in the flickering candlelight of the palace hall. As she entered her dressing chamber, soft drapes muffled the world beyond, and the attendants stood ready with the familiar panoply of powders and pigments. First came the souse, the infamous white lead and vinegar paste. Elizabeth allowed the attendant to press each dollop of chalky cream into her brow, her cheeks, and her chin. The paste clung stubbornly to her skin, seeping into every fine line until her face became a pale canvas. The attendant worked methodically, smoothing each layer with a small padded brush. But the Queen felt the slight sting of dryness as the paste cracked along her temples. Yet not a single complaint passed her pale lips. She bore the discomfort with the stoicism of her station. Each layer of white lead was another affirmation of her royal dignity, an armor that disguised the toll of years and hinted at the divine purity expected of a sovereign. Next, the attendant brought the vermilion a rich cinnabar-based rouge that glowed like liquid flame. With a finer brush, she traced the outline of Elizabeth's lips, then filled them in with deep crimson. The colour was startling against the chalk-white background, transforming Elizabeth's visage into a living portrait of vitality. She closed her eyes briefly to allow the pigment to settle, conscious of the toxic mercury hidden within its vibrant hue. The attendant then swept a pale dust of red across her high cheekbones, lending the illusion of youthful bloom. For all its artistry, the process was an ordeal. Her skin tingled under the chemical weight, but she endured it without flinch, knowing that her smile must be as radiant as the hope she inspired in her people. With paint complete, the Queen turned to the monumental task of coiffure. Today's hairpiece was even more elaborate than the day before, a towering contraption of copper-hued curls, woven through with strings of lustrous pearls and tiny crystals that would catch the lantern light in 1,000 sparkling facets. The attendant swept away any stray wisps of Elizabeth's own hair, then positioned the network of combs and pads. Pin by pin, each section of the wig was secured to her skull, the metal prongs piercing flesh before anchoring into the structure beneath. Elizabeth bit her lip at each puncture, the occasional flare of pain dull beneath her calm exterior. Nylon binders and fragrant resin were smoothed over the base, ensuring the creation would hold throughout the festivities. As the final comb clicked into place, Elizabeth allowed herself a slow exhale, savouring the faint sense of triumph that came with being fully masked as Majesty. Now came the evening attire itself. The brocaded gown of midnight blue, threaded with gold and silver in intricate floral motifs. The attendant lifted the garment, a weighty confection of velvet and satin, and slipped it over Elizabeth's shoulders. The rich fabric splayed out behind her in a courtly train, glimmering with overlaid precious gems that had been sewn into the very fibres. The bodice was cut with a modest V, revealing just enough to highlight the curve of her neck and the high collar that framed her face. Puffy sleeves tapered to slender wrists, each seam encrusted with a tight cluster of seed pearls. As the attendant fastened the tiny laces at the back and buttoned the sleeves, Elizabeth felt the bodice hug her torso like a second skin. Beautiful, oppressive, necessary. The gown's weight pressed upon her hips, requiring an extra measure of poise with each step. When she raised her arms, the heavy skirts shifted with a gentle rustle, like waves caressing a silent shore. Each footfall felt like a statement, an insistence on presence and power. The attendant fastened an ornate bonnet atop her head, a cap of velvet lined with satin, pinned under the heavy curls of the wig, and decorated with a plume of delicate ostrich feathers. A drop of aromatic pomade was brushed behind each ear, infusing the air around the Queen with a subtle scent of rose and sandalwood. Throughout this intricate process, Elizabeth's expression remained composed, as serene as a polished marble statuary. She gazed into the long mirror, the silvered glass reflecting back an image of unearthly perfection. She adjusted the angle of her chin, ensuring the candlelight would catch the high points of her cheekbones. A final glance at her lips prompted a slight touch to refine the curve of her vermilion smile. Today, diplomacy would play out not only in the hush of whispered debates, but in the brilliance of her appearance, a silent overture to power, wealth, and refinement. Stepping back, a hush fell across the chamber as the attendants beheld her. In that moment, Elizabeth was both woman and myth, an icon born from layers of silk, paint, and bone. Outside, the palace corridors hummed with anticipation, heralds tuning their trumpets, footmen polishing armor, and the soft drumming of servants coaxing the banqueting hall into readiness. But within her private sanctum, Elizabeth felt the quiet culmination of hours of ritual, an almost dreamy reverence, a gentle fatigue, mingling with the high note of proud resolve. She allowed herself one more reflective moment, the stillness before the performance, the calm before the storm of courtly pageantry. For tonight she would stand beneath the antlered chandeliers flanked by lords and ladies from distant lands. Her every glance, every gesture, even a single flutter of her painted eyelashes, would convey messages far more potent than words. And so, without a tremor in her posture, she turned and swept from the chamber, the hem of her gown brushing the threshold with regal authority. The softly lit hall awaited, and with each purposeful step, Elizabeth carried both the artifice of her station and the fragile beating of the woman within, ready to greet the world anew. The banquet unfolded within the vast tapestry-clad dragon hall, its marble floor concealed beneath rich carpets, and the air aglow with flickering candlelight. Tall candelabras burned without end, their flames dancing like willow, the wisps above the gilded canopy. Ambassadors from Spain, France, and Scotland flanked the throne dais, each arrayed in silks and finery that gleamed softly in the mellow light. As Elizabeth entered, her skirts sweeping out in a measured fan of brocade and jewels, she appeared as the very sun at the centre of a nocturnal sky. The glitter of gold thread caught the candlelight in tiny lightning flashes, and the scarlet of her lips shone like a beacon against her powdered face. The formal salutations began without the ceremony of words alone. Elizabeth inclined her head in a gentle nod, offering a half-smile to each envoy as they approached. Her eyes, bright beneath arched brows, registered every compliment and proposal for alliance. In her measured steps, she maintained a deliberate distance, close enough to acknowledge those she favoured, yet far enough to remind all that she held the realm in her grasp. Every slow turn of her head, every brief pause before responding, was a diplomatic gambit, the language of royalty woven through gesture and poise, rather than mere speech. Servants in embroidered livery drifted through the throng, guiding pages bearing silver trays. Musicians, violinists, and lutanists provided an elegant counterpoint, their notes drifting like soft incense through the hall. Ladies-in-waiting performed a silent choreography, pouring tea and offering small cakes in delicate porcelain cups. Elizabeth did not choose the cloying wines set forth for common guests. Instead, she selected the finest rose, infused tea, poured from a gilded urn into fragile cups. The pale infusion, scented with petals and honey, spoke in euphemism of peace and prosperity. Each guest lifted the cup, pausing mid-air to inhale its aroma before sipping, as though tasting the very ideals of harmony. In this setting, Elizabeth's authority was not merely seated upon her throne. It was manifest in every artful exchange, every subtle reassurance she granted to the besotted courtiers of distant courts. A well-timed nod could signal hope for trade. A faint curl of her lips might encourage a hesitant petitioner. She read the faces of her foreign guests with the skill of a portraitist, noting the flicker of eagerness in a Spanish count's gaze, the careful restraint of a French envoy's posture, the bright curiosity in the Scot's keen eyes. Through these silent readings, she shaped the evening's currents, directing conversation toward subjects of her choosing, deflecting inquiries that threatened unrest. Diplomacy, in her hands, was an invisible tapestry threads of alliance drawn tight by her skillful fingers. The feast's rhythm was orchestrated as precisely as any court masque. Violin strings rose with each soft tread of Elizabeth's slippers. Guitars chimed as she paused to accept a foreign duke's greeting, and the harpsichord's gentle chords signified her movement toward the next cluster of ambassadors. At her side, her ladies whispered her next engagement, but their voices were drowned beneath the hum of reverent awe. Each clink of porcelain, each measured curtsy, became an offering to her grandeur. As the night wore on, the hall's shadows deepened, and flickering light played across the painted vaults above. Elizabeth's influence radiated outward, far beyond the dragon-stitched fabrics that enclosed her. In whispered conversations at corner tables, her guests repeated her measured words, spoke her promises of goodwill and mutual benefit. The French ambassador, his voice low and earnest, declared to his companions that English rose tea was a symbol of shared prosperity, while the Spanish plenipotentiary quietly noted that the Queen's steady grace bespoke a stable ally. Each echo of her presence, carried back to foreign capitals by couriers and ship captains alike, would extend her reign's reach further than any pennon could fly. By the time the final chords of music drifted into silence, Elizabeth stood once more at the centre of the hall. She offered a graceful farewell, inclining her head to each assembled dignitary, as torchbearers formed two columns to guide them toward the exit. The clamour of silk and the shuffle of boots faded into the corridor, leaving behind only the scent of rose and the faint trails of candle smoke. In that moment, the Dragon Hall seemed to exhale its solemn beauty, as though aware that its role as stage for royal pageantry had been fulfilled. Elizabeth lingered for only a heartbeat in the empty hall, absorbing its grandeur one last time. Marble underfoot, tapestries looming overhead, she felt the potency of her performance settle like a cloak around her shoulders. Her footsteps echoed softly as she retraced her path toward the private chambers, where the vestiges of her morning's labour makeshift corset and powdered visage would again be shed for solitude's sake. Yet the echoes of the banquet, the low murmur of strategic whispers, would follow in her wake, carried like precious cargo by those who had borne witness. Thus concluded, an evening destined to be recounted in hushed tones and detailed letters across Europe's courts. But for Elizabeth, the true measure of success lay not in fleeting applause, but in the enduring ripples of influence that would persist long after the Dragon Hall's candles had cooled. And as she crossed the threshold into the silence of pages yet unwritten, she carried within her the satisfaction of a queen who had mastered both spectacle and subtlety, forging alliances in the hushed reverence of an enchanted night. After the final chords drifted away, the royal ladies and honoured guests departed in hushed reverence, and the great hall fell into a profound stillness. Elizabeth retraced her steps through the echoing corridors, each footfall a reminder of the night's ceremony now past. As she reached her private chamber, the scented tendrils of rose, amber, and burning beeswax followed her like loyal shadows. There, upon a low bench beside her dressing table, lay the trappings of the evening's grandeur pearled bodice, embroidered sleeves, jewelled ruff each piece, waiting to be returned to its place in the wardrobe. With a gentle exhale, she began the slow, deliberate process of unmaking herself. First, she unclasped the heavy velvet cloak, easing it from her shoulders so that it pooled upon the floor in a dark, shimmering tide. The scarves of scent that clung to its folds uncoiled into the air, merging again with the lingering perfume of the hall. She stepped out of the brocade skirts next, unpinning the jewel-studded clasps and letting the weight of satin, damask, and gold thread fall away. The farthingale followed the hoop skirt's rigid circle, slipped free of its fastenings, collapsing in a soft rustle across the marble floor. As each layer came undone, Elizabeth felt her shoulders lighten, as though shards of moonlight were being drawn from her spine. She slipped from the stays in the final act of liberation, the stays' ribbed bones sighing in release, and she sank gently onto the stool, her breath catching in a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Before the mirror, she reached for a warm linen cloth that had been steeped in soothing herbs earlier. The fabric, still faintly fragrant with chamomile and lavender, glided over her skin and carried away the remnants of paint. The white lead of the souse came away in brittle flakes, revealing the tender flush of her cheeks beneath. Her vibrant vermilion lips lost their glossy sheen to the cool dampness of the cloth, and she pressed it again to her jaw, where the heat of the night's festivities still burned. Next, she removed the hairpiece, her own pale curls tumouring forward as the copper tones and pearls were lifted free. The combs slipped from her scalp, leaving a gentle sting that spoke of both privilege and pain. Elizabeth shook her head once, her hair falling in disarray around her shoulders, and she allowed herself a small, private smile at the messy softness reclaiming her. In the mirror stood a different woman, no longer the luminous sovereign of the banquet, but a mortal frame carrying the weight of woe and wonder in equal measure. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her skin was sallow from exhaustion, yet her lips still curved in determined defiance. She rose and leaned forward, smoothing a stray lock from her forehead, and then sank back onto a cushioned chair. Her glance fell upon a half-finished letter, resting beside her inkstand, an urgent dispatch from a provincial governor, pleading for relief and reassurance. The thought that Dawn would demand her attention again stirred a familiar poignancy in her chest. Power was no gift to be laid down at night, but a relentless mantle she must bear each day anew. Yet in that moment, Elizabeth found a kernel of solace. The unwavering line of her smile, though faint, reminded her of her role as the embodiment of her people's faith. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling the faces she had greeted that evening. Foreign emissaries, eager nobles, and loyal servants whose hopes rode upon her steadiness. She whispered to the quiet air, "I am the vessel of my nation. My strength is their promise." With that affirmation, she reached for the worn journal still open on her desk. Her quill hovered over the next blank page, but she paused, knowing that words could wait until the morrow. Rising once more, Elizabeth moved to the stone-framed window that overlooked the silent gardens. There, upon a small side table, stood a delicate porcelain cup filled with the last of her evening tea, infused with rose petals and sweet almond undertones, a final gesture of ritual closure. She lifted the cup to her lips, savouring its gentle warmth and floral clarity, feeling it settle softly in her stomach. Each thoughtful sip seemed to whisper that, even amid the court's grand designs, there remained a simple act of sustenance, a quiet moment between woman and the lingering echoes of her triumphs. Behind her, the chamber's lone candle guttered, casting long, wavering shadows against the linens and tapestries. The ticking of the antique clock on the mantel broke the hush with measured insistence, each click promising the near approach of slumber, and with it, the fleeting reprieve from public burdens. Elizabeth placed the cup down, its china saucer chiming softly against the table's edge. She straightened her back and offered one last glance to the reflections in the dark glass beyond the pane, where pale moonlight swirled amid the courtyard's silent oaks. In her heart, she carried the knowledge that Dawn would once again demand her presence, her counsel, and her composure. Yet for this breath, she allowed herself to linger in the comfort of night's embrace. She slipped her skirts gently back beneath her, drawing a linen shift around her form to ward off the evening chill. Then, with a soft footfall, she approached the bed draped in silks of the palest hue. The plush rushes at its foot invited her weary body to rest, and she fell back, closing her eyes to the distant glow of stars beyond the window. As she drifted towards sleep, Elizabeth's final thought was a pledge to herself that tomorrow she would don her robes and renew her oath to her people. Yet as the palace's ancient heartbeat slowed around her, she surrendered fully to the promise of rest. The night cradled her, and in that gentle surrender, the queen found a fleeting freedom, one that would sustain her through the unending days of rule, and remind her that, even behind crown and court, she remained Elizabeth, a woman held in both strength and solitude. Elizabeth snuffed out the final candle, its flame vanishing into the hush of the chamber as though reluctant to relinquish its vigil. She lay back upon the silken pillows, the whisper of velvet and lace still clinging to her skin. In the half-light of slumber's edge, she drifted into dreams of a sunlit garden, where blooms of rose and lily nodded in a gentle breeze, and the air was sweet with the promise of spring. She was but a carefree princess there, bareheaded and barefoot, weaving among the flower beds with laughter unguarded, each petal brushing her fingertips like a fleeting memory of innocence. In that dream, the world was small and soft, free from intrigue or expectation. She chased butterflies among hedgerows, paused to dip her hands in clear streams, and heard only the song of morning birds, unburdened by the weight of a crown. The sky was an unending canvas of pale blue, and her heart was light as dewdrops on green leaves. In that moment, she let herself believe she could remain forever in that sunlit realm, untouched by the cares that echoed through castle halls. Yet all too soon, the dream dissolved like mist under dawn's first breath. Elizabeth stirred, opening her eyes to darkness, pierced by a single shaft of moonlight through the lattice. Her bed's canopy swayed gently, and she tasted the lingering sweetness of sleep upon her lips. But as her gaze drifted upward to the empty throne chamber beyond the arched doorway, the stark reality returned with the gravity of a knight's oath. The throne stood silent and unadorned, its cushions flattened by hours of absence. Beyond it lay corridors where plotting eyes waited, where pleas for mercy and petitions for justice would soon fill her waking hours. She sighed softly, pressing a hand to her chest as if still holding the warmth of the dream's fleeting joy. Her smile was faint, carrying both nostalgia and resolve. For Elizabeth, the morning's tasks were more than routine. They were the continuation of a personal tragedy shared by any who must bear great responsibility. The necessity to transform oneself into an emblem, a living symbol, while enduring sorrows that rarely found voice. Her reflection in the polished metal of the chamber's mirror seemed almost pitying, a pale likeness that recognized her private pain even as it maintained its regal poise. In those quiet moments before dawn, Elizabeth considered the paradox at the heart of her existence. She was a woman tasked with representing a nation, embodying its hopes and its fears, yet she remained unseen behind layers of ceremony. Neither the rose-dappled dream of a carefree girl, nor the resolute sovereign at daybreak, could wholly claim her identity. She was both, and neither, adrift between memory and duty. The delicate blossoms of her dream world stood in stark contrast to the hard edges of the throne she would soon ascend. As she rose to greet the new day, Elizabeth's thoughts turned beyond her own story to the larger lesson it offered. To bear a mask, she murmured to the silent air, is to invite both admiration and isolation. She remembered the courtiers' gazes at last night's banquet, how each compliment had concealed a calculation, each smile masked a question. The world, she realized, was a stage of curated images, just as her morning face of powdered perfection hid the ache of fever and the sting of tight stays. So did every person, in every age, present a crafted self to their audience. She moved to the small desk by the window, where a servant had left a fresh basin of rose-scented water. As her fingers touched the cool porcelain, she considered the era she inhabited and the age to come. The face she painted each dawn would endure beyond her lifetime, captured in portraits that proclaimed her unchanging majesty. Yet in those lifeless images, no hint remained of the solitary night battles she waged with her own fragility. They reminded Elizabeth that the tragedy of the crown was not hers alone, but a universal plight of any who felt compelled to wear the perfect mask. In the soft glow of the lantern, she penned a final entry in her journal, weary lines that spoke to the timelessness of this struggle. Let the world remember the triumphs, but let the keepers of memory also recall the silent sacrifices. For every face that greets the day in confidence, there is a heart awakening from restless dreams, yearning to breathe without pretense. With the words still warm upon the page, she closed the book and laid it aside, its leather cover worn from use, much like the soul that had filled its pages. The palace outside had begun to stir, the first footsteps of servants echoing in distant corridors. Elizabeth took a deep breath, steeling herself for the hour to come when petitions would arrive and decisions would be demanded. She smoothed the folds of her gown now, a softer, simpler shift of linen, and allowed herself a whispered promise. We will repeat the dance again, layer by layer, smile by painted smile. And though the world sees only perfection, I will carry both mask and memory in quiet defiance. And so, as the dawn finally broke with pale gold light, Elizabeth stepped from the sanctuary of her private chambers into the corridors of power. Behind her, the journal lay closed, a testament to nights of longing and mornings of resolve. Ahead of her lay the continuous cycle of portrayal and performance, an endless reprise that transcended her personal tale and resonated with every soul who had ever concealed their truths behind a perfected visage. In that shared experience, she found a kind of kinship with all who wore masks, a whispered solidarity that spanned centuries and kingdoms, uniting monarch and commoner in the universal drama of existence. As our evening's journey through Queen Elizabeth's ritual draws to a close, you may wonder what, exactly, you carry away from these whispered corridors of power and the quiet crucible of her solitary reign. Today's video has been more than a portrait of pomp and circumstance. It has been an exploration of the hidden costs behind every polished facade, a meditation on the human heart concealed beneath layers of paint, cloth, and bone. What you receive from this story is the gift of empathy. You have seen the sovereign's private moments, her fevered nights, the ache beneath her stiff stays, the sting of lead upon her skin, and recognized, at last, that even the most exalted figures share the same vulnerabilities you do. Elizabeth's nightly shedding of her armor echoes the moment when you finally close your laptop after a long day online, brush off your public persona, and allow yourself the quiet truth of rest. In that shared act of undressing the mask lies the recognition of our common humanity. The core message of today's tale is that power and loneliness often walk hand in hand. The same traits that elevate a person to prominence, discipline, composure, unwavering resolve, can also build walls around the heart. Elizabeth's greatest strength, the ability to remain unflinching under scrutiny, was inseparable from her solitude. Her mask of white lead and scarlet lips protected her, even as it isolated her. Likewise, in our modern world of social media and curated identities, the glossy images we project can create invisible barriers between ourselves and others. The tragedy is universal. The more perfect our public face, the deeper the hidden crevices of our private selves. Today's video offers values that transcend its historic trappings. It reminds us to honor our own moments of vulnerability, to acknowledge the feverish nights, the throbbing anxieties, the quiet doubts that no filter can erase. It calls us to practice compassion, knowing that behind every confident presentation or polished photograph lies a person who may be wrestling with unseen burdens. And it invites us to find strength in solitude, to use our quiet moments as opportunities for reflection, growth, and renewal, rather than as times to feel diminished by our loneliness. How can these lessons be applied to modern life? Mindful unmasking. Just as Elizabeth removed her stays and laid makeup each night, we too can take time perhaps before we close our devices to set aside our carefully crafted personas. Allow yourself a few minutes at day's end to breathe deeply, to journal honestly, and to acknowledge how you truly feel. This ritual can become a grounding practice, reminding you that your worth extends beyond the roles you perform. Authentic connection. Recognizing that everyone wears a mask encourages deeper empathy. When you interact with friends, family, or strangers, consider what lies beneath their social veneer. A kind word or a patient ear can be the balm that eases another's hidden ache, just as Elizabeth's attendants offered her a simple cloth soaked in herbs to soothe her fever. Solitude as strength. Loneliness need not be a void to dread, but a space for self-renewal. Like the queen who found quiet resolve in her private chambers, you can use periods of solitude to cultivate inner calm through meditation, reading, creative pursuits, or simply a walk in nature. In those moments, you recharge the very spirit that carries you through life's public stages. Empowered vulnerability. Elizabeth's willingness to endure pain for the sake of duty reminds us that showing vulnerability can be an act of courage. In professional or personal spheres, admitting uncertainty or asking for help does not diminish authority. Rather, it can humanize you and foster trust among peers and loved ones. Ultimately, today's video serves as both a lullaby and a call to awakening. A lullaby that soothes the restless mind by weaving a sleepy tapestry of history, and a call that rouses the heart to embrace authenticity in an age of illusion. By stepping behind Elizabeth's mask, we glimpse our own, and by honoring her silent aches, we learn to honor the quiet struggles of those around us. Thank you for joining this twilight journey into the private world of a monarch. May the lessons you glean guide you through your own dawns, balanced between the masks you wear and the truths you hold within. Good night, and may your rest be deep and your awakening gentle.